Hi, and welcome to your guide to language access and working with an interpreter, training for new staff and interns at Nationality Service Center. Today we're going to talk a little bit about language access, and first I think it's important to define the term itself. So language access describes the method or means by which we communicate with limited English proficient clients. So LEP is defined as the self-assessed ability to speak English less than very well. And as you'll find through your work at NSC, we work with a diversity of different clients, many of whom are limited English proficient. So when we're talking about language access, we are talking about a variety of method or means through which we are able to meaningfully interact with our clients and provide needed services. So those could be interpretation services, either in person or over the phone, the use of translated documents or materials. But it's important to recognize that we need to use professional means or methods, not the use of family members, friends, things of that nature. Why is language access important? So in Philadelphia today, there is approximately 12 to 15% of our population that speaks English less than very well. We were defined as limited English proficient. And therefore, we need to be able to meaningfully interact and provide services to those populations, especially at an organization like NSC that whose mission is to serve immigrants and refugees across a variety of areas. So on your screen now, you'll see a map of various neighborhoods of Philadelphia divided by census tract, and the darker blue areas represent higher concentrations of populations that are limited English proficient. So you can see that in an area like Philadelphia and many other urban areas around the country, we have pretty dense pockets of our city and our region where the use of language access is really imperative for that population. So not only is it kind of imperative for provision of services, it's actually the law. So under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, any organization that receives funding from the federal government is required by law to not discriminate on the basis of national origin. So national origin has been interpreted by the courts and by these executive orders and subsequent clarifications that you see listed here as including language services. So our obligation under Title VI as an agency that receives federal funding is to provide equal access to services. Otherwise, we are discriminating against that individual. Now, who are agencies that receive federal funding? Obviously, NSC receives funding from a number of different sources, federal funding, private foundations, others. Other examples would be hospitals that receive Medicaid funding or federally qualified health centers, organizations like the school district or the welfare office or the DMV. These are all organizations that receive either direct federal money or pass-through money through the state from the feds and are obligated to provide equal access to services, meaning language access. So a couple of the things that when we're talking about language access, we often talk about translation and interpretation, and it's important just to distinguish and make sure we're clear on what the difference is. So translation describes the process of actually changing written documents from one language to another. So we'll talk about using translated documents or translated materials, whereas use of an interpreter describes either a live or over-the-phone person who is interacting in that individual situation as a means to communicate with the limited English proficient individual. How does someone become an interpreter? So when we're talking about interpretation, it's important to recognize that there are various levels. We can have community interpreters who may simply be bilingual in both languages and may be able to serve in more community layperson interpretation roles. However, when we're talking about, service provisions, just case management, in the medical office, it's helpful to use trained interpreters. So interpreters often go through a class, such as the classes offered by NSC. And then once they have completed that class, they are eligible to take certification based on the class that they've taken. For example, here at NSC, we offer the Bridging the Gap interpreter training, which is a medical interpreter training where interpreters can be certified in interpreting in the medical setting. Great. So it's also important to recognize that in interpretation and meeting the obligations of language access can come in many different forms. The two most common forms that you'll see here at NSC are on-site interpreters, actually the three, telephonic interpretation, and bilingual staff. As well, this could be bilingual providers themselves, so perhaps a doctor or a medical resident who speaks both languages. And it can be appropriate at times to use ad hoc interpreters, as I mentioned, in non-confidential settings where you simply may need to communicate the day and time someone needs to arrive at NSC, or you can use a community member to find out who someone in the lobby is waiting for. So these are examples of times when it might be appropriate to use an ad hoc interpreter. An ad hoc interpreter is not appropriate for any kind of substantial conversation. So a conversation about a client's needs or a service plan or something of that nature, you are required to use one of the top four mechanisms in order to meet the obligations of equal access. Here at NSC, we offer one of our primary language access tools is phone interpretation. Over your first week or so here at NSC, you'll be shown how to use a phone interpreter by shadowing another staff member or intern. We have two contracts with phone interpretation services. Language Line is our primary and Pacific Interpreters is our backup. We will provide you with the information on how to access both, as well as an opportunity to shadow a staff member. Some things to remember when you are working with an interpreter throughout the session. You can feel comfortable, whether you're using a phone interpreter or an in-person interpreter, taking a few minutes to set the stage with your clients. It depends how much you go into this, kind of depends on the complexity of what you'll be covering. So for example, you could say, hello interpreter, before we begin, I'd like to lead a brief introduction with my client, and allow the interpreter to introduce themselves because you are including them as a third party in this conversation. So for example, you could continue, hello, my name is Gretchen. The interpreter is on the line and is probably in a different city. The interpreter's job is to interpret everything you say to one another. It's important that you pause after each thought to allow the interpreter to say what you just said accurately and completely. The interpreter will not add, change, or omit anything that we say. If there's something you do not understand, please tell the interpreter so he or she can let me know. You can also take this opportunity to emphasize confidentiality or preview the session and ask if there's any questions. Now this whole preparation, beginning the session activity may not be necessary if you're simply calling someone to remind someone of their doctor's appointment tomorrow. But it could be necessary if you're beginning a longer intake or a more substantial conversation with the client, including those conversations that may include more confidential or sensitive information, just to ensure you're on the same page. Another tip is if you anticipate it being a relatively challenging conversation, it can be helpful to remind clients to pause after each thought to allow the interpreter to interpret. Sometimes when we get upset or agitated, we can tend to forget to do that, and our clients can tend to forget to do that as well. And so reminding them that, you know, you really need that interpreter in order to understand their concerns and to be able to help them and support them is really critical. During a session, there's a couple of things to remember as well. You can always speak directly to the client, not to the interpreter. So there's no need to say, can you tell her, can you ask her if, you can simply say, how are you feeling today? Or how can I help you in the first person? We recommend that you speak more slowly and in shorter segments so the interpreter can interpret. You'll find the pace of this over time. Some interpreters can take a little more information in. Others, you need to be more succinct and short in your phrasing. There's no need to speak more loudly. Sometimes there is that tendency to speak more loudly to try to make your point understood or heard, but there's no need to speak more loudly to the interpreter. Tips for closing the session, we recommend that you employ the teach back method. For example, if you are calling someone to remind them about an appointment, so can you tell me, I just want to make sure that we've understood each other through the interpreter. Can you tell me what day and time you'll come to NSC? And can you remember what you'll bring with you when you come? These are opportunities for the client to demonstrate understanding and for you to ensure that your call has been successful or your conversation has been successful through the interpreter. This is a really important step. Sometimes things get lost in translation, literally, and so this teach back method allows us to ensure that everybody's on the same page and we're able to move forward with the next steps. So some what if scenarios. What if you don't know what language the client speaks? What language the client speaks, excuse me. Their languages are listed in ACT under usually the head of household or primary client. You can see a list of languages. Many clients can also answer the question, what language do you prefer or what language do you speak? Because as you see in ACT, you may see a number of different languages listed, and knowing what language they prefer to use on the interpreter line can be helpful. Then we get into the scenario of maybe not having a less than ideal interpreter. So what if it doesn't seem like the interpreter is relaying the appropriate information? This can happen in a lot of ways. They're not saying much after you've said quite a long few sentences, and they only say a few words, and you feel like they're not relaying the entirety of your message, or vice versa, you're only saying a few words, and yet they've talked for 4 or 5 minutes, and you feel that they are embellishing or adding on or, you know, trying to intervene in the situation beyond simply interpreting the words that you're saying. It's completely within your right to say that you're going to terminate the conversation with that interpreter and find another interpreter. Your goal is to make sure that client gets the needed information. So if the client isn't comfortable with the interpreter or you're not comfortable with the interpreter, it's a service that LanguageLine and Pacific interpreters are providing, and it's completely appropriate to provide that feedback and ask for another interpreter. You can also, if it's a particularly egregious situation, take that interpreter's ID number and send your supervisor an email so that we can follow up with the complaint to the appropriate interpreter service. Another question we often get is, what if I'm calling to remind my client of their appointment tomorrow and I'm not sure they'll answer? It takes a few minutes to get an interpreter on the line and dial out, etc. So if you're not sure your client will answer, we recommend that you call first without an interpreter and inform the client that you'll call back with an interpreter. This can be an efficient use of your time and an efficient use of the interpreter line as well. We do pay for the interpreter line by the minute, so we want to think throughout these interactions about efficiency and smart use of that service. So I hope that you learned a little bit about using an interpreter here at NSC. And as I mentioned, I encourage you to seek out an opportunity to shadow a staff member or another intern in using the interpreter line, and don't hesitate to answer any questions, to ask any questions that you have in the meantime. Thank you.